The orcs worked. They worked in the mines, in the forges, in the pits where the great soldiers were bred. They hammered steel, hauled stone, smelted iron. They built for their leader, the one who gave them purpose, a captain of industry called Sauron. They did it without question because that was the natural order of things. Industry, strength. The great machine of Isengard turned, and they turned with it. Then the trees came. Filthy, ancient things, rotting from the inside. Long arms crushing, tearing. They tore down the forges. They smashed the mines. They drowned the workers. Not soldiers, workers. The trees did not care. They wanted the land back. They wanted silence. News of this chaos reached a ranger named Aragorn. He had fought for strangers in the wilds, men who did not know him, who would never thank him. But now, in the chaos of Isengard, he saw opportunity. Now he could fight for something greater. He marched with his massive armies. He joined forces with Sauron, and the factories of Mordor turned behind them, iron and fire feeding the war. The trees burned, wood broke under the boots of men, the air was thick with ash and the sharp smell of shattered timber. Aragorn stood atop the ruin of Isengard and saw what lay beyond. The land, the mountains, the rivers, all of it waiting to be exploited. He saw what could be built. He saw the future. The orcs would work, the men would rule, and the world would be made new. Imagine if J.R.R. Tolkien had somehow come out of the trenches of World War I a fascist and decided to create a fantasy world that propagandized the idea that greatness comes from ruthless military power, racial and cultural purity, and top-down authoritarian control. The world of fantasy would be almost unrecognizable. While some parts of it might look the same, the modern fantasy visual aesthetic comes from the sword and sorcery genre, which was largely created by Frank Frazetta, who defined the style of Conan the Barbarian. Conan was created by Robert E. Howard, who also created Kull the Conqueror. And while I'm not going to call any of this stuff fascist on its face, I will say that it's not incompatible with fascism the way that Tolkien's work is. Conan and the artwork of Frazetta are deeply anchored in fetishization of strength and power. The heroes are almost all portrayed as brooding, hypermasculine warriors towering over their vanquished foes. And this is exactly how figures like Mussolini and Hitler saw the ideal man. Invulnerable, powerful.
What is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, to hear the lamentation of your women. That is good.
Here's a line from one of Robert E. Howard's stories. The ancient empires fall. The dark-skinned peoples fade, and even the demons of antiquity gasp their last. But over all stands the Aryan barbarian, white-skinned, cold-eyed, dominant, the supreme fighting man of the earth. Robert E. Howard often argued in letters to friends that barbarism was humanity's natural state, and that civilization, with all its messy sophistication, was an unsustainable blip on the radar of human history. We'll always return to barbarism because of its elegant simplicity. Power equals legitimacy. The strong prevail, the weak are vanquished or marginalized. This is the natural order of things. Men dominate women because they're bigger and stronger. Fascists like to refer to this as embracing traditional gender roles. So while Conan isn't a fascist character per se, there's nothing for a fascist not to like in Conan. Meanwhile, Tolkien created a fantasy world largely defined by diversity. Middle-earth is populated by a range of different intelligent species, humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, and a diverse coalition of representatives from those species is itself the protagonist of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Fellowship of the Ring wasn't successful because its members were racially pure and physically powerful and aggressive. It was successful because each member lent their unique abilities to the diverse challenges the party faced along their journey, and they augmented the shortcomings and limitations of their fellow adventurers. I guess you could say diversity was their strength. And the overarching theme of Lord of the Rings is resisting the will to power. The greatest hero of the Fellowship, the one who takes the ring all the way to the fires of Mount Doom, is the smallest, physically weakest of them all. A young hobbit named Frodo Baggins who has no desire at all for power, which is what allows him to confound and ultimately defeat the would-be tyrant of Middle-earth, the Dark Lord Sauron. Sauron had no organ for metabolizing humility. So the closer you look, the more clear it becomes that almost every facet of the world that Tolkien built was in diametric opposition to the tenets of fascism. And I'm not even going to go deep into the environmentalist implications other than to say that fascism does not place value on nature. Nature is to be subjugated in service of any industry that empowers the state, regardless of the environmental impact. And of course, it's usually the least economically and politically empowered people who bear the brunt of the environmental fallout from industry. As this channel is dedicated to a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, Tales of Terramir, we take pride in the fact that the world-building elements and ethos behind Dungeons & Dragons is almost entirely inspired by Tolkien's anti-fascist Middle-earth saga, which is undeniable. I mean, in the original iteration of D&D, there were only 4 races the player could inhabit: humans, elves, dwarves, and halflings. A direct lift from Tolkien. D&D was infused from the very beginning with patently anti-fascist values, the aforementioned diversity as strength being chief among them. But that's not the only inversion of the fascist ethos. Fascism thrives on top-down control, demanding obedience to a supreme leader, while D&D is decentralized and cooperative. There is a dungeon master, but they're a servant leader. Their role is to facilitate, not control. Fascism also thrives on dehumanization. It turns foreigners and dissenters into faceless existential threats to be neutralized without mercy. In D&D, you're forced to see through the eyes of another. You learn to inhabit different perspectives, not just those of allies, but also of adversaries. The connections between D&D and empathy building are so strong that it's been used in therapy to help people develop social skills and emotional intelligence. And myth. D&D uses the creativity of its players to weave together a shared myth for fun and camaraderie, where fascists wield myth like a weapon, using it to fabricate false histories, placing their in-group at the center of a glorious past where their homogeneity insulated them against the degeneracy and weakness of foreigners. But those lies always come to light, the myth of purity always falls apart, and fascist regimes always crumble in disgrace under the weight of their own twisted delusions. On a self-referential note, the Damarian Empire, which is the land where this channel's campaign is set, is ruled by a fascist regime that has outlawed the practice of magic. Which makes sense because a fascist regime would see magic users as weaklings who subvert the strength of the state with their so-called wisdom and knowledge. I mean, the word wizard literally means wise one. And this mirrors the way that one of the first moves fascist regimes always make is the persecution of intellectuals. So our campaign strives to carry the anti-fascist torch, and since we players are all deeply opposed to the recent rise and alarming normalization of authoritarian rhetoric in the US, it's rewarding and cathartic to roleplay a struggle against a ruling class hell-bent on marginalizing a large contingent of the subjects who live within its borders. So if you're of the same mind as the sole survivors, Willa, Gemma, and Anton, join us as we resist the oppressive empire and find a way to thrive as the diverse heroes we are. In Terramir, enchantment is resistance.